Right, without further ado, I am going to then jump into the presentation. And the purpose of this webinar today is really to assist you on the day when it comes to answering any form of timed assessment. So that can be a test, it can be an exam, it can be ITC. And in order to assist you, there's various things that I would like to draw to your attention, and also various strategies or tips I would like to give you that can assist you on the day. So if we look at your studying journey, your studying journey starts off with whatever the related topic may be. You kind of familiarize yourself with that material on your own, right? If you're with Sibaldi, we've got all the videos that we provide to you. If you are with another provider, obviously you would possibly be attending lectures, you would be working through your IFRS statements, you would be working through very simple questions in order to bed down the principles, to see some practical application. And all of that is effectively just to gain knowledge and understanding in respect of some specific subject matter and some technical knowledge. I always say to all of my students, please, please, please make sure that you always understand why you are doing something rather than how. Don't learn processes. Certainly on a CTA, ITC level, it's not going to work. You always need to ask yourself, why? Why am I providing for depreciation? Why am I processing an acquisition adjustment to fair value? Why am I raising deferred tax on this? Or why am I not raising deferred tax? So always understand the why. Right, so that's kind of the first step that you undertake. Then secondly, you would probably be doing some form of self-assessing. You're going to do some practical applications of questions. You would do a mix of easier questions and you would build up into more difficult questions. You would start with very simple questions, only dealing with a specific standard, and then moving into more integrated questions. All right, so this is all part of your learning journey or educational or growth journey prior to the day of the assessment. And those areas are not my focus for today. Those are separate things that can be discussed. What I want to focus on is the formal assessment. If you follow any sport, let's say like a football game, this is like, if it's your final exam, it's the final of the World Cup, right? You are on the football pitch, you've done all your practices, you've gone through simulations, you've picked your team, you've studied your competitor. All of that was done pre. Now you are on the field, right? And what can you do on the day to make sure you get the best possible outcome? Because that's all that matters, right? The fans don't care what you did prior to that. They only care that you won on that day. And that is your only objective, is to win the game on that day. Yes, there's a whole lot of preparation, but what do we do to make sure that we put ourselves in the best position possible on the day in order to win that game or that match, right? To win the World Cup, for example. Noting that as in a football game and in your assessments, this is a timed assessment. So there is definitely going to be some pressure, okay? If you're playing on the football pitch, there's added pressure of the crowd and a lot of pressure maybe from your country. I don't know, maybe here you've got pressure from family or parents or work or self-induced pressure, right? But you are here, you've got a certain time-based assessment. And what is it that you need to do on the day to try and maximize your possibility? In a football game, it's to win the game, right? And so I would ask you, when you take that assessment, and I mean, this is such a straightforward question, but if you are not clear in terms of what your goal is, every decision you make on the day in order every decision that you make needs to be with that goal, that outcome in mind. And this will make more sense later, right? But you can only have one goal and one objective for the purpose of that assessment. So if I asked you very straightforward, I don't know if someone wants to put their hand up and unmute themselves or type it in the question box in the chat box. What is the one objective for when you take a test or an exam in terms of a timed assessment? I know it's straightforward, but I want to hear it. I would say, from your lips to my ears, but at least want you to write it out, right? It is not a trick question, but I need you, it's not only Bryn, all of you know. I'm waiting for that chat function. Okay, to show competence, to pass. So competence is kind of like an APC assessment. Competence, I guess, in a ITC or CTA assessment would be to pass, right? So I guess to show, yeah, to pass convincingly, to attempt all questions. Okay. At the end of the day, when it comes to a football match, your only goal is to win, right? Whether you win 5-0, 5-4, you need to win. 0-0, and that's a penalty kick, penalty score, what do you call it, penalty kick out. You want to win. So your objective purely, right, is, I would say, first and foremost, to pass the question effectively, to show competence, okay? And sometimes, and I would say in most instances, that would be attempting all questions, okay? But I want you to remember, what is your goal? Your goal always needs to be, what must I do to pass this paper? Okay, in the same breath, what should I not be doing, which is going to cause me a hurdle or some form of, what do you call it, detour from reaching that goal, okay? So in order to have that goal of winning, you have to have a strategic approach on the day. I think so many students are just so kind of set in the technical of what needs to be done. All right, I jump into the question, you read the first one, you jump into the question, and it's just go, go, go. And it's almost like shooting from the hip, right? It's, you caught off guard and it's just like bam, 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 bam. Let me try and score wherever I can, okay? Where, I mean, that's not how a football match is played on the day, right? It is strategic. There is a game plan, right? We know who's playing. We know what our formation is. We know who's playing forwards. We know whether we're playing more of an offense or defense kind of game. There's a game plan, right? And you have to have a game plan on the day. You just cannot go in there and just like hope for the best, right? And we're going to look at what that game plan potentially looks like. And you need to be very disciplined on the day, right? We're going to look at some things that you should be implementing, but having the necessary discipline on the day, which aligns to your goal, right? You're not running after every ball. You understand that there are other players in the team that also fulfill a certain function. And we are also going to look at what I refer to as just having some insight into how a test or exam is set. And I think if you have a bit more insight into that, you will have a bit more buy-in into a possible strategies that are put forward to you for answering test exams under pressure in terms of a timed assessment. All right, so what do I want to look at? There's two core areas I want to focus on this evening, right? And the first one is, do you have a game plan when it comes to answering tests or exams? And maybe you kind of do have some like subtleties, maybe you calculate, how much time you should use for each question. Someone here said about attempting all questions. That's a game plan, right? So it's not just you going in there wild and you're like, I'll give it my best shot. Like, let's see what we can do. You're not going in blind. You have a strategy, right? And the second thing I want to discuss is just, discussion questions are your future, right? We see this more and more and more. I'm going to look at some discussion questions and just look at, on the day, how do we go about them, and what skills do you need to develop, and what can you apply in terms of tools on the day to help you reach your goal. Your goal is to pass the assessment. Okay, so what can we do in discussion questions to help us? Right, so effectively, we are going to discuss things that you should be aware of and things you should do in order to reach your goal. I'm going to repeat it repetitively ad nauseum today. Your goal is to pass, okay? In comparison, it's not to score 100% in task A, right? It's no good winning the first half and doing horrifically in the second half. right? So score at the end of the day when the game is up. What do we need to do to make sure that we have the best game plan or strategy in place? So in line with the goal that I spoke about, your goal is to maximize your marks, to get the maximum marks that you can based on the studying that you've done in a fixed amount of time, right? You agree with me? Now, there's about, I think, 7 things that I would like to discuss just in terms of this game plan. And now the first thing I want to go through is understanding how assessments are structured. Okay. Now, most of you probably have never set a test or an exam. You've never needed to. But I think it is quite valuable to understand that in a test or an exam, anyone that sets a test or exam, whether it's at UNISA or UJ or Millpark or ITC, right, sets them with a certain ratio of marks, which are easy, some that are medium, and some that are very difficult. All papers are set like that, okay? So I'm just going to call this easy, medium, hard, okay? I'm not talking about a task component. I'm talking about the paper in total, right? If we look at ITC, it would be all 4 papers in total. The majority of the marks are easy, okay? And when I say easy, they are marks that students should be able to get, right? If they've done the necessary studying, they should be able to get these marks. They are not exceptionally difficult, and there will always be enough of them to pass the paper, always. Okay, that is like the 101 if you ever set a test or an exam, and when it's moderated and reviewed by external parties, they look at that. What is that ratio of easy to medium to hard? Okay, the medium ones are a bit more tricky. You might need to apply a bit more critical thinking. Certainly are attainable, but it certainly, you would need some deeper level of understanding. And the higher ones are really for those students that are wanting to get 90% plus, right? So the easy ones are effectively your low-hanging fruit on the tree. Very easy to pick, all right? And there are enough of them in a question. Now, what I've said here in terms of an assessment structure is that you need to understand that not all marks in a question are created equal, and that it is so, so important to understand. Remember, what is our goal? Our goal is to maximize our marks. So if not all marks are created equal, right, that means we should focus on the marks that are easier and not get stuck in the marks that are difficult. So many students feel that they need to get 100% for task A or 100% for a certain task because they really know this stuff well, and they extend on their time and they go beyond their time. And it's quite difficult to get those marks, right? That's like doing fancy footwork in a football game, but all that fancy footwork is going to lose you the goal. It is not necessary for us. Our goal was not fancy footwork. Our goal was to pass the assessment, to maximize our marks. So understand when a paper is set, that not all marks are equal. And it is important for you to start being able to identify where are the easier marks, where is the complex stuff. Look for the low-hanging fruit and do not get caught up in fancy footwork, in the difficult stuff, which is going to rob you of your time and rob you of your goal. Okay? See it so often. You might ask, well, how am I going to know what's easier, medium, or hard? Those things often come through practice. You will know what is hard because it blows the socks off of you, right? So these things come with practice, which I will emphasize over and over again. You will not arrive on the day having all these skills that I'm talking about in terms of your game plan to answer the test. It's like if you're in a World Cup final, you're just not going to rock up there on the day and expect your team to gel and have these fantastic passes lined out. That had to be practiced, right? And here too, things need to be practiced. So number one, right? Not all marks are created equal. Be careful where you put your attention. Number two, I refer to something as a payoff profile. And it kind of aligns to this first point. Now, if I had to draw a diagram and I break an exam or a test down into its subcomponents, on my x-axis, I've got time, and on my y-axis, I've got my percentage, okay? So generally, when you answer a question, initially, you're reading the question, you're not going to get any marks, you're familiarizing yourself, you're planning how you're going to answer this thing, and then your marks are going to shoot up as time passes, right? But you are going to get to a point where those marks are going to start tipping off. And the payoff profile, if I look at the time here, let's say these time durations are the same, X minutes, right? Call it 10 minutes. And let's just make this 1 minute to make it very simplified. In these 10 minutes, or let's say 11 minutes, right? Look how many marks you got. But now look at the next 10 minutes, how many marks you got. Compare this to this. Can you see it's not equal, right? So in any question that you do, you will generate generally the most marks in the first 2/3 of the time that you will spend there, okay? Also, often I talk about the structures, not all marks being created equal. Within a task as well, there are sometimes more complex things. And it's these things that are more complex within a task that are robbing you of your time and not giving you a good payoff profile, right? You want to be doing what's going to offer you the biggest and best chance of reaching your goal, which is to score the maximum amount of marks in a fixed amount of time. So based on this, I cannot spend endless amounts of time on one question, right? It would make more sense for me to go to the next question and start generating these initial marks. And this is going to tie up with one of the points I talk about later, is to never leave out a question, because any question does have easy marks, right? And in any question, unless, you have absolutely no cooking clue what's going on, you don't even know what standard is, you've never heard of this in your life. But if it's a discussion question, you can get a mark still, 1 mark for a conclusion, even though as long as your conclusion is logical in relation to what you are writing, right? So always making sure you get this original payoff profile. The next thing I want to talk about is time management, okay? And I'm surprised, I have students that email me and on CTA level 2, and they're like, I didn't finish my paper. And you've gone through undergrad, you've gone through level 1, and my first question is, did you calculate a budget, a time budget for each question? And the answer is no. And to me, that is absolutely critical. So if you've got a paper, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. If you've got a paper for 40 marks, right? And you've got 60 minutes allocated to that, then you know that each mark is 1.5 minutes. So go in the beginning, immediately, if you can see, right, this is a 10-mark question, straight away, 15 minutes. That is all I have, right? Take your watch, place it somewhere where it's in front of you, okay? Because time can run away with you, especially if you get really excited. I studied this, I know this. I saw a question, I really know this. I actually know more than they even asked me, right? I've seen students put a little clock on their table, like one of those old school alarm clocks, right? Whatever you need to do, you have to manage your time, because you have a goal, and that is to maximize your marks within that fixed time period. You cannot leave out questions. You cannot get stuck in these upper areas. So make sure that you are calculating a time budget, right, for each subcomponent of a task, and you must be disciplined. Now, I know I struggled with this as a student, and to a certain extent, it is a budget, right? So if there is a question, discussion questions sometimes take a bit longer. So be wise, maybe get the other stuff that you know quite well. If it's journals or it's quite easy, or the smaller mark allocations, get them out the way and see if you can almost, have a surplus on another question, but not more than 10%, right? And use it on maybe a more complex or a discussion question. But you can never, right, spend 2/3 on of your time on one question that maybe only was like 5 marks. Okay. And that's usually if you get sucked into something and you have this view that, you want to perfect this question because you know it so well. That's that fancy footwork story. We're trying to win the game, right? Not to win the one question or not to win the first half, the whole game. It's a full 90 minutes that we need to play, right? You have to also practice this. It is crucially important because understanding or getting a feel for how little time you actually have comes through practice. And you also obtain a bit of a feel of, right, I only have 15 minutes for these questions. What should I be addressing or what should I not be addressing? How can I structure my response? So this time management, you have to practice taking assessments under a simulated environment. So there's no distractions, no phones, put your phones in another room, turn it off. The world can wait, right? It really, really can wait at this point in time. And sit down, work with the time pressure, even if you feel like you're not ready, because there are other skills that you are learning here. It is not purely a technical IFRS skill set that you are effectively being tested for in a time-based assessment. It is also managing time, understanding that you need to be strategic, that you need to plan, etc. Right, the fourth one, I'm sure you've heard about this one, is to read the effing question. And this is so often a problem because it's like you do all the preparation for the day and you read the question wrong, right? Or you miss something out. It's like scoring an own goal. It is so important that you do not put yourself on the back foot by missing something. And often this is a result because of pressure. And I would also argue that it is often because of the style we have of taking in information these days. I don't know if you can think back to a recent example where you read something so quickly, but you actually misread it. It happened from a WhatsApp I got from the friend the other day, like, I read it so quickly while I was probably busy doing something else, or I read an email and I was just, you read the stuff so quickly, and we so well trained in taking in so much information and effectively scanning it. I mean, even on Facebook, Instagram. I mean, if you think about how much you are taking in and scanning, it is not detailed analysis, word for word, of what is being presented to you. Right? That's a completely different way of looking at something. And that's definitely not how you look at social media, right? And often I find it gets worse and worse that students are in this program method of scanning and they miss keywords. And maybe you can think of a recent example where this has happened to you and led to a misunderstanding, right? So as a tip, and I know this sounds stupid, but I don't care how stupid it looks or how stupid it sounds, because my only objective is for you to maximize your marks. How you do that is absolutely irrelevant. But I have often suggested, and I did it with my masters as well, when reading questions, is that you take a ruler and it forces you to focus on one line at a time, because you're so used to reading all the lines together and scanning, right? And you only pick up words. So I would suggest that you take a ruler and you hold it under that first line and possibly even put your finger on each word and force yourself to get that word, one word at a time, into your brain, right? I know it sounds like possibly ridiculous, but if you miss a word in a required, you stuffed. I don't care how many hours you've studied, right? To me, doing that and eliminating any risk of not answering every component of the required, or missing, for example, you must include journal entries or you must exclude deferred tax, right? Things are quickly overlooked, especially when you're under pressure. So practice my suggestion, use a ruler, use your index finger, and scan it word for word. There is no time limit placed on you in reading a required. For me, the required is the most important piece of reading in a question. Read it twice if you must, right? Take your time. So as I said, if you stuff this up, it doesn't matter how much time you spend studying. It really, really is a shame. And I see it so often. When you're reading the question, especially when you come to kind of bigger, more complex questions, or always ask yourself, what is the crux or the core issue? So, for example, if someone has provided journal entries and they're wrong and you need to review them, the core issue is find the mistakes, and the question will say either fix them or tell me why they're wrong. But in simple words, what is the core issue? Okay. And when we look at a more complex example just now, you'll see sometimes make sure you can always bring it back to the core issue, because that is what the focus of the task needs to be. And always underline or look for the keywords. Are we discussing? Are we reviewing? Reviewing means someone has already done something, and you need to agree whether what they have done is right or wrong. Always with reasoning. But I will discuss it when we come to discussion questions. Okay. Skipping questions. Someone mentioned that. You can never, ever leave out a question, right? Why? Because every question has easy marks. At the end of the day, you want to maximize your marks. How can you do that? And unless you have, as I said, no clue what's going on, right? If there is a conclusion mark or a presentation mark, you need to try and get it in that question. You will get that mark provided there is some discussion, even if it's a sentence or two, and a conclusion that logically flows from that, okay? Even though your view may be agent or principle, you're saying it's a principle because A, B, conclusion, it's a principle. Maybe you were totally technically off the boat, you can still get that conclusion mark, okay? Remember, our focus is very much on making sure that we understand that we need to maximize our marks on the day, right? And in line with that, we need to make sure that we have a strategy. So in terms of that strategy, if I'm looking at point number 6, it's not to just jump into the question and start with the first question, okay? No one is going to care where you start. At the end of the day, it's whether you scored the goal or not, right? Whether you went straight for the goal, whether you tried to pass it to various players, it doesn't matter, right? So with questions, I would propose that firstly, looking at the required, see to what extent they are linked. So sometimes you will see that questions build off each other. And you can see it by looking at the names of companies, by looking at the dates, by looking at the standards. If they are linked, you must do them in that order, okay? If they are completely standalone, you mustn't, but I would highly suggest that you start with what you feel the most comfortable to build your confidence. When you sit down, your emotions are going to be heightened, you're going to have some anxiety. Get in your seat and assist yourself in knowing that you can do this. And by believing you can do that is by start scoring some marks. So don't just jump into part A when part A might be your most difficult standard, right? Maybe part D, and we'll look at an example. I'm going to show you an example with all of these so that it makes a bit more sense. Maybe starting in the last question is going to be the most easiest for you, right? So make sure that you have a strategy in terms of when you read the required, where are you going to start, okay? Remember, we've spoken about time allocation. We've spoken about reading the required, not skipping questions, understanding that not all marks are equal, understanding that there's a payoff profile as well. Last thing I want to talk about is workings. And workings obviously relate to calculations. A lot of you know this, but I would rather not assume anything, right? When there is a question, consolidations, impairment calculation, whatever it is, right? And there are calculations. You must show me your calculations very clearly. And I often refer to them as dropping breadcrumbs as a trail, like Hansel and Gretel, where I can follow your thought process. I must be able to follow that first breadcrumb, which is from the information in the scenario, all the way to the last breadcrumb, which is the amount that you are using in your solution. Okay, so can another person follow your logic step for step? Okay, now a lot of you probably do this well. I mean, I've marked a lot of ITC. Some of my issues is that there is a number and it's referenced working one, and I go to working one and nowhere can I see this number. Nowhere, right? Now, I mean, for ITC, and it would be the same for CTA, whoever's marking your paper is not required to take out their calculator and rework anything, okay? That is not a requirement. You are meant to show me what were the inputs into that calculation, what was that total, show me that total that was used in your solution. And you hopefully know this, workings on their own carry 0 marks. You can have perfect workings, 100% correct. The question will never ask you for a working on its own. It will ask you for journals. It will ask you for statements. It will ask you disclosures. So that is what I want to see. I want to see the journal and the amount. Once I see the journal and the amount, only then do I go to your calculations, not the other way around, right? We never mark calculations first. We look at the solutions, okay? So this understanding, putting yourself in the best position to score those marks, show them very clearly. If in doubt, provide more detail, because every little input, right, can earn you a mark. And don't throw unnecessary marks away because you've not shown your calculations. Or if you're running out of time, you must carry those numbers through. Must. I still see on ITC students, the statement is empty, all the workings are there. 0. You have not answered the question, right? All of this must be practiced, okay? These skills are not developed overnight. You're going to not magically arrive in assessment tomorrow and know what to do. No chance, okay? Make a note of these things. Start calculating your times. Be strategic in your approach. Let's have a look at an example. So this is out of UNISA's current test 1 that was written for 4864. It is an IFRS 15 and IFRS 11 test 1 question, 40 marks. So let's implement some of these things, okay? Strategic approach. We want to score maximum amount of marks, limited amount of time. Okay, so this question is for a total of 40 marks. The time that I have is 60 minutes, right? On a 1.5 ratio, I can see that each of these is only 15 minutes, right? This is how I would go about straight away, okay? So there's 4 questions, right? If I'm going to leave out 2, I'm pretty stuffed. Okay, if I'm going to leave out 1, it's also a bit of a problem. So 4 questions, all of them pretty equal. Remember, I'm going to be strategic. I'm going to just have a quick browse through the questions and see what are the discussion verbs, or what are the action verbs? Discussion, prepare journal entries, discuss. Okay, 3 discussion. So maybe with all the discussions, you're like, oh, okay, not for me. Okay, but let's see, right? Maybe you can do some of them because you're not going to pass on the journals alone, right? Remember, we're going to be strategic. I didn't just jump into A and be like I said, bam, 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 shooting from the hip. Let's go, right? And after 30 minutes, be like, oh, crap. I still need to do B, C, and D. And yeah, I probably scored 100% for A. But anyway, so part A, we're looking at a transaction price. Transaction price, I know some IFRS 15 stuff. Between who are the entities, AMPRO and KBGS, in respect of armored trucks. So it's a discussion around transaction price. We have to include amounts in our calculations. I know I'm going to reference them. Just have a look at number 2. This is also IFRS 15. What are the companies? AMPRO and G2. Looks like different companies, okay? Now, obviously, you would be reading this with the ruler. Okay, but I don't have enough time to read it all with ruler and go through it line by line. But what I want to show you is that A and B are not linked. Okay, they're not linked to each other. I could start with either. Then number 3, prepare journal entries of AMPRO for the sale of the 10 cash and transfers to Bad Boys. That is another entity. So A, B, and C are not linked. I don't have to answer them in order. Part D is an IFRS 11 question. And maybe I'm like, I know IFRS 11, right? IFRS 11, what are they asking for? Classification and recognition of the agreement in terms of a joint arrangement. So this is going to be joint operation versus joint venture. Maybe like, man, I know IFRS 11, like I can wax this, okay? So remember, you need to be strategic, right? You're not going to just jump in the deep end. We've got 3 discussion questions. You've got 1 journal. Start with the one that you feel the most comfortable. The last one is all IFRS 11. It's only 15 minutes. Maybe get all the IFRS 11 out the way, and then you can move your mind over to IFRS 15, okay? One thing I've not mentioned is never jump between questions. Never do half of A and then come to do some of B and say, I'm going to come back to A. Then do some of B and maybe say, oh, maybe I'll come back to C. You start getting yourself very confused and you will never have more time. So when you get to a question, commit to the question and end it, right? So in terms of our strategic approach, everybody's game plan might look different, but you must have a game plan. My personal game plan would be, right, I can see 15 minutes each. I've got my little clock out. I'm going to start with IFRS 11 because I know IFRS 11 quite well. They're going to ask me to classify this joint operation, joint venture. I know that there are 4 or 5 criteria that I need to look at. I'm going to look at discussion questions just now, but I have a bit of I have a game plan, right? Then I'm going to come to the IFRS 15 stuff. I am never going to overshoot on my time allocations. I'm not going to leave out anything because I know, look at this. There's an easy mark for communication. There's another easy mark here. Please note, you're going to read carefully. Journal narrations are required. You're going to lose 1 easy mark if you are not going to provide those narrations, okay? So just going through my game plan. Number 1 was understanding not all marks are created equal. If I look at this, for me, principal versus agent is easy, okay, in my view, because I know the criteria come out of Appendix B. This is also, I can find it straight in my book. These are calculations. Students generally quite comfortable with calculations. A discussion of the transaction price. There's going to possibly be things like variable consideration, etc. This possibly would be the hardest for me. So I wouldn't necessarily start there. So I've got a strategic approach in terms of how I'm going to do this. I understand not all marks are equal, and I'm not going to overshoot in my time trying to maximize my marks in task A, okay? Even in task D, I'm going to put down what I know. I've got my 15 minutes, I move on. Understanding the payoff profile, as I said, you're going to earn most of those marks. I mean, research shows this in the first probably 2/3 of the time that you are spending on a question. The more time that you spend, it's going to slope off. Bad return on your investment. Managing your time, looking at your budgets. What are you allocating? You know, maybe here, I'll be able to answer this in 10 minutes. You don't have to, right? But if you are super comfortable, get it done and use a bit more of the time here, okay? But not excessively. It's not necessary. And as I said, it's a budget. It's not kind of a, you know, hard and fast of what it should be. Read the question, use your ruler. So you go discuss the transaction price. What do you know in terms of transaction price? I know it's variable consideration. I know that there is maybe a discounting factor. You know, those are the things that that you would need to take into consideration. So what does transaction price involve, right? Are there more performance obligations? I don't know. It's a contract between AMPRO and KGBS for the sale of, okay, we've got 2,500 armored trucks. We know it's goods, it's not services, to be recognized in terms of IFRS 15 for the 28th of February, 2023, include amounts and calculations. So there's definitely going to be calculations here, and there's going to obviously be some variability around the transaction price. I don't know if they are, I mean, it's the technical details not important for this question, but maybe there's a right of return, maybe there's deposits, who knows what the case might be, okay? But use your ruler, and I would even, take your finger, you're not reading a WhatsApp or an email or Facebook, you're not scanning all of this at once, slowly work through it, okay? Understanding what is the core issue for each of them. For example, part D, it's the classification. Venture, joint operation, okay? That is the core issue. B, agent, principal. That is the core issue, right? I know these examples are probably a bit more simple, but they certainly demonstrate what I'm trying to show you. Not skipping questions, having a strategy, right? As I said, my strategy is starting with part D. I'm going to build confidence and then go to IFRS 15. I'm not going to go do some A, some D, back to A. That is the worst you can do. Okay, don't skip. You need to commit. If you don't know, you don't know. Okay, sometimes, I mean, if I think back to a student, somehow a light bulb went, I was like, oh, yes, I remember. It's coming back to me. Okay, then we thank our lucky stars and our prayers have been answered. That's something came to light again, and then you can go back. But unless you really have to, I don't recommend it. Show those workings, show those calculations, and you need to practice this under time pressure. Okay. The next thing I want to move into is now second part of the presentation, which is discussion questions. So there is a good chance that I'm going to slightly overrun in time, but hopefully this is certainly worth your time, a good return on your investment. Okay, so discussion questions. We saw that in this previous example, which is test 1, right, at UNISA. How many marks was that? 75% of that paper. Right, so you could not pass that question without attempting those discussion questions. 75% of those marks, which is 30 out of the 40, was discussion, okay? Absolutely crucial. When it comes to discussion questions, you cannot just kind of jump in, okay? Especially when it comes to big questions. It's like someone's holding a gun to your head and it's like ready, steady, go. And you're just like, write whatever I can. Okay, just write. And then when I mark questions, I can see the lack of structure, or I can see there's like a lack of a game plan, because either it's contradictory. You say one thing and now you start changing your mind, which is a huge problem in a discussion question, because we just question your whole understanding in respect of that question, right? Or it's repetitive. It's like, there's some people that say one thing, but it takes them 5 sentences to say it, okay? I don't know, I've seen a lot of them, or I've been exposed to them. I'm like, yes. You've said the same thing to me 5 times over. You could have said that in 1 sentence, okay? We're under time pressure here, okay? If you're talking to your buddy on the phone and you want to elaborate and color it in, absolutely, okay? But we're under time pressure here. You've got 1 sentence that you could write, okay? And you need to think like that ink is expensive that you're writing with, and it really needs to be value adding. I mean, if you think at the end of the day, what are you preparing this all for? It's to go into practice, and in practice to present. If I give you an example of what I also do on a consulting basis, I give technical opinions to corporate listed entities. They don't have time for me to sit there for half an hour to explain things, yeah, but this and that and this and this and this. They want to know, what is the IFRS standard? How did you reach that conclusion? How did you apply it? And what is the conclusion? That's it, right? So it's very focused and to the point kind of discussion. And I can only do that if I plan. I can't just arrive there and like babble on about things. I've planned, right? I've planned whether it's writing a technical opinion, whether it's going into a meeting. I've planned very clearly what I'm going to say, in what order I'm going to say it, and where I want to land up, and what are the points that are the critical points I want to convey. So first and foremost, if you come to a discussion question, you must plan. You need some form of structure, okay? There is a saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And I truly believe that is the case with discussion types and questions. You need some form of structure. Now, the question is, where do you get structure from? Okay. Now, generally, it would be intro, then it would be your discussion, which addresses whatever is the question is asking, so addressing that core issue and then your conclusion. Okay. Now, there's not going to ever be any marks for the intro, so don't waste your time on that. Okay. Get straight to the issue and make sure that there's a conclusion. So we've got a bit of an idea now in terms of a structure. Conclusion, as long as it logically flows in one sentence, making sure that the conclusion answers the core issue. For example, is it an agent or is it a principal? So based on the above factors, I conclude that it is a principal. Done. Okay. It's a consequential mark that you will get, but it has to tie back to the core issue. So how do we go and structure this discussion in a bit more kind of, what other guidance can I give you to assist you with structuring your discussion? Okay. And generally that structure is going to come from either your IFRS standard, right? Or it's going to come from the scenario, or it's going to come from both. If I give you an example of IFRS standard, okay, where you would look at structure, there's so many great examples. So let's have a look at one I recently looked at. A classic one is your IAS 38 intangible assets, right? The ones that are internally generated. You are going to look at, I think there's 6 requirements in IAS 38. You're going to look at things like technical feasibility, right? You're going to look at whether there are resources. You're going to look at whether it's practically possible. So you've got those 6 criteria sitting in the IFRS standard. Another one, IFRS 10, relevant activities, power, and with your power, being able to direct those relevant activities in order to get a variable return, right? That's an example of IFRS 10. Right? But you understand what I'm trying to say. So there the structure is coming out of the standard, okay? Joint ventures or joint arrangements. What is a joint venture? It's something that is structured through a separate legal entity. You're going to look at whether you have rights to the net assets or specific assets, right? So all of these things are coming specifically out of the standard. And those are going to help you to structure. It's like you're breaking down this discussion into smaller components. But where are you going to find out what those smaller components are? Either you will look at the required and look at, does the standard give me components that I need in order to demonstrate that in terms of IAS 38, IFRS 10, okay? Even IFRS 9 financial instruments, amortized cost, SPPI test, business model, right? And it can come from the scenario. So often we see something like journal entries, and the journal entry has like 6 components to it, or we see transactions, right? So your structure is going to come from either something in the scenario or from your IFRS standard, or sometimes both, right? You can have a journal entry, maybe, for example, they capitalized certain intangible assets or recognized intangible assets on acquisition in terms of IFRS 3. That is one component. What does IFRS 3 tell us about recognizing intangible assets on acquisition, right? It talks about the need for separability. What are the criteria for separability, right? So you need to be able to develop these skills through practice and identify, how can I plan my response? Where am I going to get the structure from? Okay, especially in bigger questions, there has to be a structure, either IFRS or scenario. I mean, it has to be somewhere, okay? Then you're also going to look at your mark allocation, right? If you've got a question that is for 10 marks, you can immediately say 1 is for the conclusion, and that's going to give you 9 marks left, right? If, for example, this is an IFRS or IAS 38 discussion on terms of internally generated assets, you know that there are 6 criteria, okay? So you can see that I have to talk about 6 criteria. So that's generally going to be 1, max 2 marks per criteria. And this is going to tie up to something I'm going to talk at the bottom here, which is the depth versus breadth. But I want you to see that your structure, when you come to planning, is going to be determined of how you structure it by your mark allocation. Okay. If this question was for 30 marks, 1 for your conclusion, okay? I mean, I'm exaggerating now. 29 marks, 6 criteria. you know that, gosh, I've got 6 headings for intangible assets that I need to talk to. There is a lot that I'm going to have to address, at least probably, I mean, in my very exaggerated example, 3 or 4 bullet points under each of these 6 criteria in order to get that mark, or in order to get the mark. So can you see how my structure is being informed by my mark allocation? My structure is being informed by what are the IFRS criteria that I need to apply? Or my structure is informed by what are the transactions or journals or events in the scenario that I need to address. It's like taking this elephant, because these discussion questions are huge elephants, and breaking them down into smaller bite-sized chunks that are not so overwhelming, okay? But you need to be able to know where to look in order to break it down, okay? Mark allocation, look at the question. Am I referring to a specific IFRS standard, or am I looking to a scenario? Okay, before I come to the third one, let me actually jump to the fourth one, because I think that is actually quite important and it ties up to it. And it's this principle of depth versus breadth, okay? So I think this is something that students really, really struggle with. And this is a good example. If the mark allocation is only for 10, right? And I know that that IS 38 example that I spoke to had 6 requirements, right? You can see that I don't need that much depth, because there's 6 things that I need to cover. And if I talk about the criteria and the application, I'll probably get 1 to 2 for each of them. So I can see by covering the breadth based on the mark allocation, I don't need to go deeper. The mark allocation does not allow for it. The time allocation does not allow for it. Whereas if I look at the same question for 30 marks, can you see that just addressing the 6 is not going to be sufficient, right? If there is a huge mark allocation, it is going to require more depth. Can you see that? Right? I really, really hope that you can see that, because if you can see that, you can answer these questions so much better. Another example is when you are reviewing journal entries, and maybe there's like six journal entries, or there's 6 components to the journal entry, and there's like the journal entry, or the things that you're looking at are like 4 or 5 different accounting standards, right? Can you see that's very broad? I'm asking you on maybe IFRS 9 and IFRS 3 and IS 12, there's a lot of coverage there, okay? Chances are that in a question that is testing coverage and across standards, you will not also be tested on depth, okay? So when you practice questions, look out for this. Look at this breadth versus depth thing, okay? You're not going to have huge coverage testing you on 5 different accounting standards and expecting you to go into the detail of very, very particular nuances, like discussing IS 38, each of those components, right? If there's 6 requirements for IS 38 and you are asked to discuss this in a review of a journal entry, but there are 5 or 6 other errors and other standards, the mark allocation will indicate to you that you are not required to go into the detailed depths of the discussion of that required accounting standard, okay? The other thing is that usually when there is a lot of depth required, and if I go back to this example, this requires some depth because I need to talk about the criteria in IFRS 11, right? There are very specific criteria. I'm digging into IFRS 11. If I'm talking about agent principal, I am digging into the depths of what is an agent versus a principal. Can you see that's not a broad kind of coverage question? It's a very specific, detailed question. When you have questions that are focusing on depth, you will need to be using your IFRS handbook, okay? When you have questions that are based more on coverage, like review journal entries, there's 6 or 7 things that are happening. Generally, you should be familiar enough with the principles that you should not be able to go, that you should not need to go back to your standards and look up every little thing. Sometimes like your IFRS 3 at acquisition journal entries, for example, that thing should be at fair value, that you should recognize deferred tax at the respective tax rate on that fair value adjustment, that transaction costs should be expensed, that, how do you calculate the off-market component for a lease? So there's a lot of things happening there. If you're going to go, you can see a lot of things, breadth coverage, right? Yes, it's all IFRS 3, but it's all kind of like broader things in terms of IFRS 3. If you have to go back to your standard to look up every one of those little things, then your technical knowledge is not good enough. Right, then that is a technical understanding issue. But if you can understand, like if the question is deep, very focused on something specific, like can I recognize this intangible asset on acquisition? Okay, that's it. You can see it's very focused, right? You're going to require depth there. You're going to have to go to your standard. You're going to find the support for that. Then the last thing that I want to address is the need to marry theory and application of your discussion. Okay, I'm going to use some very basic examples here, and hopefully you will remember them. If you're driving and you get pulled over and you get given a fine, are you just going to accept the fine? Okay, assuming that you are a well-behaved driver, best to your knowledge, you didn't contravene any form of laws. Are you just going to accept that fine? So somewhere on that fine or that infringement, it needs to tell you the reasoning for the fine, right? There's support. What have you done wrong in order to get that fine? Let me give you a better example. A court case. I'm sure many of you have heard rulings in terms of court cases. So on the day where the judge gives the ruling, can you imagine the judge, he or she is just like, in the case of so-and-so, I find the plaintiff guilty. Cheers, done. What? But why? What informed your decision? Right? No one would ever accept that just guilty or innocent. What was the thought process that you applied? What case law did the judge apply? What factors did the judge apply in order to reach that conclusion? Okay, and that is where the value is, right? The conclusion itself is absolutely useless for purposes of discussion question. So when it comes back to structure, for example, here we spoke about discussion questions, we spoke about the core, we spoke about the need to structure. If I come back to my IS38 example, okay, and I said that there were 6 requirements. You know that for your open book exam, copying and pasting out of the standard, 0 marks, okay? We can all open our books, right? Even my clients can open the books, 0 value. It's in the application, okay? So application of what is the IFRS principle, okay? And marrying it, you have to very clearly link it in front of my eyes, marry them, and tell me how that criteria is met in respect of the information that is presented on the day. For example, okay, basic example, going through a red traffic light is an offense and incurs a 500 Rand fine. That's the theory, okay? Application. Claudia drove through a red traffic light on Monday at this time, which is against the law, and therefore she has incurred a fine and a 500 Rand fee, okay? Can you see I've stated what the principle is and I've said how I have infringed on that principle, okay? IS38, let's tie this back to accounting. It must be financially feasible. These are one of the criteria, okay? IS30 states that and you don't need to copy and paste this, please, out of your book. You can bring it in the same, I mean, unless you really struggle with this stuff and you want to keep your thoughts concise, but you can say, for example, in terms of IS38, one needs to demonstrate that it is financially feasible to develop the intangible asset, which is demonstrated by the fact that the entity has set aside sufficient funds or has obtained sufficient funding for purposes of developing the intangible asset. Okay, can you see? I don't just say financially feasible met, or it is financially feasible. How? How? Tell me I'm guilty. Why? What? Okay. You have to always ask yourself, have I married it to what is in the case study? Okay. Absolutely have to marry it in terms of what's in the case study. So just to tie that up for purposes of how you go about answering a discussion question. You have to make sure that you have, for a discussion question, you need a game plan. There has to be a structure, all right? I can see it straight away when I mark a question, whether someone has applied some thought or not, okay? We said intro, no marks, so let's not waste our time on a CTA level. You're going to go and identify what is the core issue, what is the heart of the issue, okay? Sometimes it's not so easy to identify. I am going to give it a conclusion. Now, how can I break down that discussion a bit more? Where can I find a structure? I need to find a structure. I'm going to start by looking at my IFRS standards. I'm going to look at the scenario, and I'm going to look at what is the nature of the question. Is this a technical application of certain criteria that is out of an IFRS standard? Is this journal entries? Is this transactions? How can I start? Where am I going to find a structure to break down this elephant? And there is one. I promise you, with every question, there is one. Okay. I'm going to look to my mark allocation and see, am I going to, is it not for that many marks? So I can kind of touch on these quite, I wouldn't say superficially, but, get to the point and move on. Or is this a huge mark allocation? And therefore, I'm going to have to need a bit more depth, right? Also looking at the principle of depth versus breadth. If it is a question on one accounting standard, chances are there is depth required. If there are multiple errors, multiple transactions, possibly looking at a bit more breadth, you would not be required to go into your IFRS standards in that detail. It's possible that you don't know everything. So maybe if you have sufficient time, start with the things that you know, tick those marks off, then go to your standards. Maybe you don't know what happens if there's an existing lease, for example, at acquisition. How do you go and measure that off-market component? And make sure then when you come to the discussion, you've got this like scaffolding or this framework that you're going to apply. Okay, you've broken this elephant into pieces. Now you need to know that I need to take the principle. Everything needs support. I will not accept just a guilty fine without knowing why I'm guilty. I'm not accepting a ruling on a court case without understanding. I think you're the judge. I need to explain to everyone in front of me why I thought this person was innocent or why they were guilty. And I mean, sometimes those judgments are long, right? They really, really are. So your support is IFRS, okay? If you're dealing with tax legislation, it is the Income Tax Act or VAT Act or whatever it is. That is like your ammunition, right? That is what you have to use, right? That is what your arguments need to be founded on. But you cannot present the arguments on their own. You must marry them to the case study, like as clear as daylight in front of my eyes. Bring them together. Show me this is the criteria. This is what we have in the scenario. Move on, right? Be guided by the depth based on the mark allocation. And as I said, it is so critically important that you make sure that you practice the stuff, because it does not arrive overnight, okay? Practice under exam conditions. Make notes, for example, the things that I told you to be mindful of. As I said, you have to have a game plan. You're not just jumping in the deep end. You've got even more of a game plan when it comes to discussion types of questions. And know that not all marks are equal. They really, really are not. It's not designed in that way. Know that there's a payoff profile. Know that you need to be strategic, right? Your goal is maximum marks. So every step of the way, be strategic. What can I do to put myself in a better position? Read that question carefully. Do not leave out questions. Right, I know that I have utilized more of your time than promised. I do hope, let me see if there's any questions, that I have answered. There is a recording, yes. So we will make that available. Yes, the law of diminishing returns, that is also true. Perfect. I don't know if there are any other questions. I truly hope that it has been helpful. I probably will look at maybe, I can go into a discussion type of question in a bit more detail, just to show you kind of like sometimes how you go and develop these structures. You do really, really need a structure for a discussion question. And it's funny, like when you do the discussion question, you break it down into smaller components, it becomes less overwhelming. It's like, you know, just completing a small component of the task. And at the end of the day, remember, I mean, if your goal is to maximize your marks, goal is to pass, you only need to get 50% right. And based on what I said right in the beginning, there are enough questions, right? There really, really are enough questions. This is how the paper is set up, but don't get stuck in the fancy footwork in trying to score 100% for some components, you know, unless you want to get 99 or 100%. And even in the time allocation, I don't honestly think it's always possible. So there is an email address there. I mean, I'll just pop my email address here as well if you would prefer to email me directly with anything. So it's just claudia@tabaldi.org. I know CTA is very stressful. It really is. If it's any consolation, it was by far my hardest year. It's the volume. It's just so much. And I felt it was better from CTA onwards. So just, yeah, as they say, FAC48, all things must come to an end. And we want to get this right and, yeah, do the necessary preparation for the day. And hopefully these things will be more helpful for you on the day. Let me just see if there are other questions. I'm not sure I fully understand the question in terms of if we're able to discuss comprehensively, we'll be able to do the technical better. So, I mean, my understanding, if you discuss something comprehensively, you like to the point, focused, structured, right? Technically, I mean, as long as your technical application is good, generally it would be better. I mean, to answer something comprehensively, in my mind, you've planned it. All right, thanks for the feedback. I wish you all the very best for this year. I know it's tough. You've got my email address. It is doable, right? But you just have to put in whatever you can every day with the time you've got. Like, don't overthink this stuff, work. And that's kind of like my motto when I get overwhelmed. Just don't overthink it. Don't let the emotions overrule everything. The biggest thing that's going to make a difference is sit down, work through questions. And as long as you're learning something, you're on the right track. Right, have the most lovely evening. I want to do this webinar before the long weekend so that you can practice the stuff before the long weekend. So it's a long studying break. So good luck with your studying break. Yeah, make it count. And you've got my email address if you need me. Have a lovely evening and thank you for your time. Cheers.